Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I am very excited to be here on a couple of fronts today. First off, to have the opportunity to speak to all of you, which is always a great way to end off the weekend. And secondly, to have a conversation with my guest, Luca Maraschi, our new CTO at mobileLIVE. Hey, Luca, how you doing today?
Great. Hi, everyone. Happy
Oh,
to be here.
excellent. And although we do work for the same organization, he is as busy as he is brilliant. So it is not too often that our paths get to cross. But interestingly enough, every time they do, and we do get the opportunity to speak, their conversations are usually so good that invariably by the end, we're always like, we should have recorded that. Today, we actually are recording that, so I hope the same rings true. But despite the nomenclature of the topic we'll be talking about today, there's nothing small about it, whether you're referring to the implementation or the associated benefits. And those benefits are all around us. Proof points of how good a digital experience can actually be, how seamlessly you can flow in between channels. I know firsthand how good these experiences can be. And unfortunately, so does my bank account. Of course, I'm talking about micro front ends, a rather pertinent topic, however, not for the faint of heart. Fortunately, Luca is not only among those who can claim a deep academic understanding of micro front ends, but also how to architect and scale them, which is really the reason why we're all here today. So let's get started. And when talking about micro front ends, I can't think of a better place than our kids. So you and I are both the parents, as I'm sure some people already heard prior to our banter, that two young boys coming up on the age of 2. So we know firsthand that growing pains are all too real. Now, shifting that focus, the pains experienced by an organization when they grow, and by proxy, the product or application, not so unsimilar. Tell me, what are some of the challenges associated with scaling an application?
Yeah, Chris. I mean, we went through a growth path and a transformative path in the last few years, right? So the whole digital transformation journey was around the transformation of not only the technology but mostly the organization, right? So we saw different models being implemented, but and if you check one of my talks, I've been talking about Slayer and the monolith, or the journey to mesh, because the reality is that if we apply a very old concept that comes from my motherland, divide and conquer, right? Divide et impera, like the Latins would say. It's a universal kind of like concept that I think applies to these large scale systems, right? And if you look at the organization as also a system, automatically we can apply the same concept. And so I think we left for last but not least the transformation of the front end of the experiences. And the last leg was clearly the transformation of the services. In between there was the infrastructure transformation, and the last is the front end, so all our web experiences. And that's where micro front ends they fit, right? They feel this transformation gap, this acceleration gap on how we can build an asset within a team and make sure that this asset is consistent across channels, but is also reusable across multiple consumers, being applications in this case. So that's where micro front ends fits perfectly, right? It's a catalyst, it's an accelerator, but at the same time becomes also the fulcrum of this all end-to-end experience journey, right? The digital transformation. So it's the last piece of this interesting package that we are building.
So essentially, keeping the monoliths or the slicing of it, the whole crumbling kind of the uncertainty came from the inside and slowly but surely making its way to the front end to be the last kind of component of that transformation.
Yeah, so as a nuclear physicist, I can only tell you that it reflects the nature, right? So we started the Big Bang with the core of where everyone was complaining, right, or was feeling friction mostly. That is has always been infrastructure provisioning, right? And then with that, we took a stage further with the APIs until we had to come the closest possible to our hearts and wallet, right? Our consumers, our customers, right? So that was a natural evolution, and it's pretty kind of like linear, right? And that's what I think it's pretty interesting about the whole journey, that the same patterns that we applied for APIs can be applied for basically front end. And that's, I think, what is magic about this whole journey, right? That is not is they're very similar, right? So we are now finally seeing the overlapping of all these dimensions, of all these pieces, and we see the whole, point of connection, the point of divergence. But micro frontends, once again, they are micro frontends are not really the holy grail, right? Is they're a pattern, as we described. They are a methodology. They are most a descriptive way of solving a problem. That is, I want to build. I want to start dividing, conquering a bigger piece of the business need, and I wanted to separate those concerns between teams. But now I have another challenge. I want to be able to, instead of being OpEx intensive, I want to basically convert these into a capital investment. I want to see how I can basically build this asset and amortize the cost of these assets across multiple, business units, teams, applications, right? The different, unit of measure. But the most important, I think, is how can I really build an internal marketplace in my organization where the outcome and the output actually is a positive and unified and consistent experience for my users. How many times we saw two things similar but being built in a different way, right?
So we've kind of skirted around an academic definition for it, but in your own, how would you briefly explain exactly what micro frontends
are? So there are many definitions, right? And I think they're all respectable, they're all valid, they're all opinions, they're all views. My view on what micro frontends are is basically very simple. It's a pure pattern. It's a pure set of tools. It's a linear. It's an overlay, in a nutshell, on top of what we already have done for other domains. Micro frontends, in a non-academic way, in my own personal view, it's a predefined pattern on how we can coordinate building, distributing, and consuming front-end experiences in a non-homogeneous environment, right? Because the reality is that it's very easy to look at micro frontends as an interesting, new pattern, right? But the reality is that the greenfield never happens, especially in the environment where we work as mobileLIVE, right? We are always working with organizations of a large scale, with environments that have natural friction to fast changes, because they are working in compliance environment. They have different processes of releasing and risk assessment. So in our case, micro frontends, we had to take it one step further and look at it as an holistic pattern to literally solve a purely Conway's related problem, right? And that's why for us, for how I at least interpret micro frontends, is a way to simplify a larger scale problem, offering a very kind of like structural way to progress into an evolution of the technology stack, which is, you usually what you do, you start with an experiment. The experiment comes with an integration phase, and then there is a consolidation, and then finally you start evolving, distributing, and then adopting at large scale.
That was your non-academic answer. Whew. It actually gave me to a great segue, because I know you and your team are actually working on some micro front end projects right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Or
yeah, so we have been working as part of our if you want to call it Office of the CTO or R&D. We have been working on try to conceptualize in a practical way the micro front ends, right? There are insane efforts done all over the internet, and we wanted to have something that was more catered to our customer base and where we saw the sweet spot for our customers and the market segments that we are supporting. And so we put together an open source library. We believe in completely in open source because we consume a lot of open source, right? We part of this effort is all orbiting around the insane work done around the Webpack Federation, for example. And so we believe in giving back to the community as much as we can absorb and consume things from the community. So it's an open source project, and we kind of took a look at the main challenges that usually we were asked during our architectural engagement, and especially around micro frontends. And we decided to kind of package it into a library that we are going to release soon. So for the whole audience, you should keep an eye on our Twitter, on all our media channels, and you will see a GitHub organization being promoted that is linked to our mobileLIVE organization. But we decided to create this new ecosystem, right? Because we see a great opportunity for everyone to consume what we are building, but also to contribute back.
No, that's fantastic. And who doesn't love a good Git toy? And yeah, open source is undoubtedly the way of the future, and to be a part of that and to be contributing to it is certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So back to micro frontends. So why, we've kind of talked about, and I love the the reference to slicing the monolith. I think it's just the kid in me that I have this like impression of all of these unruly people kind of storming a castle, and just because they're not happy with the way that things are working. So why are micro front ends a more ideal state of growth for growth than for an application than using a traditional monolith approach?
So let me just say that this statement is clearly partially true, right? There are environments where a micro front end fits perfectly, and others that clearly it's just an overhead, or is just forcing a pattern where it doesn't really fit. Where I see micro front ends fitting perfectly are in those kind of situations where we need to create a communication channel between different even business units. As much as microservices did this in large organization, micro frontends, they replicate the same thing at the experience level. So I think if you were asking me which one is the perfect environment, it'd be very hard to say, oh, use it only in that case. But the situations are usually around these large-scale applications that they have a lot of effort. There are a lot of teams that they are working on this application. And part of this application can be reused to provide omni-channel experiences. What I see usually in all our kind of engagements is that we are looking into a sweet spot between building internal tooling that they become part of the public website proposition, opposite to starting with a monolith, a single page application where it becomes way more difficult to reuse part of the self-serve experience. For example, when you are supporting on a back office application that should provide similar features but on a different channel, right? Imagine, for example, going on an e-commerce website, right? And you see your personal order list, right? That would be the same, should be exactly the same list that you see when you call the call center because something went wrong with your order. So that's a perfect case where we can have micro front ends, because the experience that we need even to impersonate our customer in that moment. It's actually where the two experiences needs to be very, very similar. Micro front ends, they also fit perfectly for composable application like a dashboard, for example. I know that is a little bit of a stretch from the initial academical definition, but if you think, it provides you a pattern of stitching elements together. So it gives you some sort of like framework for stitching and composing pieces that they can be done, from different sources. That one I think is pretty interesting, because the concept of micro frontends that I personally see is purely plug and play. Is I built a micro frontend. The only change that I can make is in the container to this micro frontends, right? Micro frontend should be immutable. Once it is built, for me as a consumer of a micro frontend, it's immutable, right?
So micro front ends are empowering organizations to create new experiences, omni-channel e-commerce journeys.
Yeah.
Something evidently new, or obviously new for, say, myself being as the user. However, what kind of changes would that look like within the organization? Like, what would that kind of breakdown look like in order to accomplish that output of the omni-channel experience, just at a high level?
You mean from a people standpoint, or from purely? So from a people standpoint, I think, in my experience, I haven't seen really disruptive patterns to be implemented when pursuing the path of implementing micro frontends. It's mostly a more kind of prescriptive way to define, like I said, a next step, a next level in terms of interfaces. Because now there is a common pattern, there is a common understanding on how these components, those experiences are developed, and how they should be consumed. So it's way more formalized than a purely loosely coupled model where you take, for example, React components and put them together, right? Now you have a package. Now you can embed it. You can use it. It's like, I usually compare it as the old time when I was building C++ or .NET with DLLs, right? So you take a DLL, you import it into your project because you want a functionality, right? But you don't change this DLL. This DLL is compiled, it's signed. You can change it, right? I know that this statement is also partially true, because clearly you can always, with reflection, change it. But it's the same concept, right? So you want to use an out-of-the-box experience. It's like the API experience. Same exact. Now we are APIfying user experiences.
Okay. Sorry, but this is, we're going back to a little bit of academic here for a second. When it comes to micro front end, implementation, it's obviously can be quite the ordeal. Are there any guiding principles that one would follow in kind of implementing micro front ends?
You mean from an architectural standpoint?
From an architectural point of view.
Yeah. So definitely. Once again, I think the main concept is what I just said, is micro frontend should be seen as immutable assets. So I develop a micro frontend, and that's how it's going to be distributed, right? So this is a core principle, or else you lose the reusability of that asset, right? Because you don't want to build like a product catalog or an order list and then have it different in terms of functionality, right? In all the consumers, you want to keep them as consistent as possible. From another architectural standpoint, which is extremely important, is how we decided to handle security and state management are definitely an important point of the whole micro front-end experience, right? So if you look at, for example, state management, one of the patterns that we are looking is that state should be propagated from the main container that we call shim, or the application, down to the micro frontends. The micro frontends should never actually communicate with each other. They should always go back to the main bus, being the container app.
I got a question about state coming up later, so don't diverge too much. Or it's just gonna
and in terms of security, clearly micro frontend should be isolated. And once again, it's like imagine like your iPhone, right, with your iOS apps, right? So they're all kind of like they're isolated, they're sealed, and that's how the micro frontend should act. So the coordination, because once again we are looking at a distributed system at the end of the day, the coordination should be done by the shim itself and not by the micro frontends. So those kind of guidelines are basic guidelines that we look at probably 100,000 feet.
Yeah.
That are probably the main key concept that I usually keep in mind when implementing or designing an architecture for a micro frontend.
Okay, so I understood when that micro frontends are not the end all be all. They're not perfect for obviously every single situation. Could you provide a practical example of maybe something in your experience where the complexity just became so great within an application that it just begged to have micro frontends?
So the complexity is not in the technology for which we need to separate it. It's purely logistical. How do we make sure that this particular experience is consistent across different channels, right? Consistent across different way of interacting with that particular functionality, and also understanding that this experience needs to be integrated within a non-homogeneous set of applications, right? So that's the kind of use case that I saw mostly strong in terms of micro frontends. But the technology then kind of comes as conways, right? So micro frontends is a way to simplify a communication dysfunction and an organizational dysfunction that is related to, once again, build once and reuse everywhere, right? So it shows a plug and play architecture model that is the holy grail for modern transforming organization. So once again, I think if you look at the picture literally from far, from even a different perspective, micro frontends is the way to solve a distribution problem. Is not a building problem only. It's purely a distribution problem.
Yeah, that does make sense. Speaking of that, can you give an example of micro front ends executed really, really well? I'm a very practical learner. I'm a little curious. Where might us and myself and some of the audience be familiar with, but might not know it?
Yeah. So I mean, once again, the internet is full of great sources, right? So myself, I always look up to some of the creators, if you want to call, or one of the main champions of micro frontends architecture. And if anybody wants to read something very, very deep and interesting about micro frontends, well executed from an architectural standpoint, Luca Maraschi, the former chief architect of design, for me has been a great reference point, right? He's now at Amazon, so definitely he has a very good big audience right around micro frontends. In terms of so from a technology standpoint, there are many, right? So if you look at, for example, the core of micro frontends, like I said, is Webpack Federation. And so I would probably look at the many examples that Webpack Federation is releasing almost on a daily basis. So I don't remember the last name, but the creator his name is Zach, and he's the principal engineer at Lululemon. Is the genius mind behind the Federation module for Webpack. So those one are probably the biggest reference point that I have. We should probably send out a tweet later with all the Twitter handles of the people I mentioned, so people can follow them and can check. But there are many great references. Those two are probably the one that I usually follow and look deep into. Myself, I had the great pleasure in the past to work with a genius mind. His name is David Mark Clements. And we saw this problem together with Matteo Collina, another phenomenal bright mind, when we were working in the past together. and we were doing consultancy, and we solved this large scale front end architecture. We are talking about, Fortune 100 and 500 scale companies. So it's definitely something that I highly recommend to check. Also, some of the work that David Mark Clements did around a library that I think he open source. It was called Riffy. Very, very interesting way to probably the beginning of this federation and compilation for front ends. So kind of like, there are different angles to see what is well executed. It really depends on the environment that where you need to implement it. I personally feel that if you look at what is probably the best example of a micro front end that I saw, I might sound very selfish, but I think one of the projects that we are currently prototyping is extremely advanced in terms of micro front ends, and we hope to be able to open source a demo of that later in September. But we definitely, that one is, it couldn't be possible without the great inspiration from all the people that I mentioned, though. So it's definitely, like I said, it all comes from the open world, and it needs to go back to the open world. I'm a strong believer in open source. So I think it's what I see is that the community every day is giving greater and greater examples of micro front-ends architecture.
No, and doing some research prior to this webinar, I actually came across the other Luca, and until I saw a picture of him, I actually confused the two of you for a few moments, just because Luca M. What are the chances of that? You guys even have similar social media handles. I thought that was really odd. So the name of this webinar is how to scale, how to scale micro front ends. So speaking of that, what architectural patterns would you use to scale micro?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. So once again, micro front end, they take something that originally was big into something that it gets very small and reusable, right? So the core of scaling is coordination. Sounds crazy, right? But in every distributed system, in every system that has a high degree of distribution and separation of concerns, coordination is the core. And so that's where I think we kind of like found some sort of holy grail in scaling the practice, right? It starts from the developer experience. It starts all from there to unify the way developers are building those micro front ends, and being 100% sure that all micro front ends are built exactly the same way. Because a tiny deviation from that standard kind of like let fall the whole rest of the pipeline, right? So when we look at scaling, once again, micro front end, developer experience is where everything starts. And then I think automation is at the core, like everything. So imagine this CLI or this beautiful templated templates that you can provision from, I don't know, your GitHub or from Backstage, whatever, right? The developer gets all the scaffolded project, and this templates contains encapsulates this structure, right? But still keeps the runtime, still keeps the whole developer experience. It keeps everything as kind of like solid slash unified experience. So just to go very practical, imagine that your CLI scaffolds a micro front ends where you get just the folder structure of what you can change and want and should change, but then all the rest is encapsulated in a library that is injected into this project, right? So that's a little bit what we are doing, for example, with our open source project. We are using our library as a way to provide a local developer experience. So you can test your micro front ends in isolation. And then we give you the opportunity to test it within a shim, so within a container, so that you can see that it works seamlessly, that is in isolation or is integrated within a shim. And then it's all about automation, right? Once that we are sure we are creating a deterministic micro frontend, now we can automate the whole stitching together, right? And so that's where Webpack Federation comes into place, where we can actually abstract it with pipelines, so that we can abstract the complexity from the developer. We can reduce the divergence to the holistic pattern, and we can actually automate it and make it strongly consistent across the different consumers, but also producers. So it's a combination of, to scale, is a combination of a very solid developer experience that allows you to have unified, consistent, and deterministic micro frontends, and a pipeline that stitches everything together through Webpack Federation.
I love how it's never just about the technology. It really always does come back to those using it. And when you say the developer experience, it's just such a refreshing thing to hear. Keeping that focus back on the people. Well, what I think you just talked about might kind of constitute as part of this answer as well. If you could only give 3 reasons why for a large enterprise that micro frontends is the way of the future for their applications, what would they be?
That's a very, very, very interesting question. So the first and foremost is, I think the top reason that I would give is providing a unified omnichannel experience for their clients. That's plain and simple. The second reason would be to announce and catalyst a cross-pollination effort between different teams that is coordinated by those kind of strong patterns. So it's a communication channel. The third is a higher return of investment. So the initial cost seems pretty high, but the return is super high, because now, like I said, we have those assets that can be distributed equally across the whole organization. So once again, it is people, operations, and money.
It's not a bad way to go.
No.
No, it like those are all incredibly valid reasons. So I know you kind of touched on this earlier, and I said that I had a follow-up question with it, so I wanted you to hold off a little bit. And it is a very, very important part to attribute for when talking about micro front ends. So how do you handle state? And can you touch on a couple of effective communication patterns to use when utilizing micro front ends?
Yeah. So believe it or not, is the most asked question from any customer that we have contact, or we are working closely with. Why? Because state, inevitably, it's a very complicated thing, right? So I need to take a little bit of an academical reason there, right? So state is the holy grail of distributed systems. So it's extremely, probably everyone knows the CAP theorem. It's extremely hard, if not almost impossible. Nothing is impossible. It's just extremely hard, I think, to get a strongly consistent system that has a high level of distribution, that serves the purpose of being available and fault tolerant. It's extremely difficult, right? So if you look at those micro front ends, they are basically just like edges into representing this unified state. Because at the end of the day, you consume a website. So the website needs to keep a unified state across the different experiences, right? To give you an example, the state of your shopping cart shouldn't change across the page navigation. But your shopping cart could demand a different layout based on its state. Ergo, the global state of your application is demanded by the individual state that the micro frontends kind of alter. So this is a big problem, right? Because where do we put the state. As all these things, they need to be independent. They need to be isolated. How do I handle the global state? So part of what we did with our library is to solve this problem, right? So we look at how pieces are encapsulated with each other, and we kind of look at different patterns, right? We could have used probably a multitude of patterns, but we went for a very traditional service broker pattern, right? So every single micro frontend subscribe to an interface and publishes the same interface. And this interface exposes some global functionalities that the main container handles. So this one gives us actually two very interesting possibilities. The first one is that we have a communication bus that is purely asynchronous. It makes the system fault tolerant, because if there is a fault in one of the micro frontends, the system still gets up and running. However, the state will become inconsistent, which is a fact that we can accept. On the other side, it gives us the composability of embedding all these micro frontends wherever we want. So now we are not bound anymore by a container that only can handle micro frontends, but now we can have some sort of hybrid model where we have a single page application that I can embed pieces of micro frontends, or micro frontends that they can by themselves even be a single page application, right? And so all this kind of like flexibility is because we separated two different type of states. So in a website, you have the so-called global state, or for people that are working with React, is the state object. React is purely the context API, or you have the navigation state, because imagine that one of your micro frontends has a navigation stack. When you press back, you want to go back within that particular micro frontends, but you also want to be able at the end, when you press the last back, to go back into the main navigation stack. So we kind of like look at this problem from learning from iOS, and we got inspired by that particular model. And so that's where our library kind of like handles those kind of abstractions, so that we can have a separate implementation for the global state and the navigation state that can be independent from React or any other library. Can be custom baked, can be the browser, can be anything. And the micro frontend itself, kind of abstract from that challenge, so that for the micro frontend itself there is just state. The other thing is state propagation, because that's a super important thing. As much as I contribute to a state, I need to be injected a state, right? Because if you imagine state in a purely kind of academical way and mathematical way, is a vector. So state goes linearly with time, non-linearly with a mutation. So what we do is that we assume that every time that a micro frontend alters this global state needs to be pushed back into the micro frontend in order for the micro frontend to contribute actively to the global state. A little bit like Git, basically, right? So that's the model that we kind of like look at. So every time that there is a state mutation, this state mutation is propagated to all the micro frontends. So the micro frontends, they have a weak access to the global state, and in this way we can actually keep the two different states in sync. It's purely kind of like an actor model at that moment in time. So we have micro frontends, they are actors on the broader application state. And so that's how basically the state operates. A very important thing is that state gets propagated from bottom up and from top down, but never laterally. So a micro frontend can never change the state directly of another micro frontend. is the shim that needs to coordinate these events dispatching. So it's imagine that the container is like a service bus in a nutshell.
Kind of sounds like the rule of a card game.
Yeah.
So, needless to say, the micro front ends require a fair bit of adjustment within an organization to implement. But talking towards the previously mentioned pattern, how would you integrate that into the development and deployment cycle?
That's an interesting point to address. So the deployment is so we need to take a step back, right? So when we look into development, development is clearly something that is purely catered to the organization. So that piece, how do we integrate? It really depends by the developer experience that the particular organization decided to implement. But on a rule of thumb, what we kind of saw as a common pattern between different organizational type is that most of the organizations, they are leaning towards a unified developer experience. They are leaning towards a system that is self-serve. So how do we integrate into that is exactly creating that template, which is encapsulated within some sort of micro frontend runtime. And that's the way we kind of like distribute that particular capability at the lowest point of friction, right? Because now we remove the concerns of like, updates, the concerns of like keeping the container version at the latest and greatest, all problems that boilerplate was always kind of like creating, right? Because boilerplate is great when you need to bootstrap something very, very fast, but at the same time, when you need to manage it and coordinate, it gets a little bit more challenging. And so that's a little bit the kind of like developer experience change, right? Is basically to continue on the path of self-serve. From a deployment standpoint, it really depends on how this web application are deployed, right? And that's where it becomes mostly a one-off intervention more than a standardized pattern. So beyond the point of Webpack Federation, beyond the point of Webpack, we are in the land of the existing pipeline. The artifact is going to be similar to the one of a traditional single page application, but now applications might be distributed so that we might have many of them that are strongly actually linked by their dependencies, but they are not aggregated into a single point. So in that sense, how do we embed within the existing CI/CD and automation practices is purely dependent on the environment where we need to implement it. But the kind of once again, last mile is at Webpack, where we can enforce some sort of guidance and structure. Then it becomes purely catered to the environment where they need to be deployed.
All right, this is my final question before we get to some Q&A from the audience. So let's not be naive here when talking about micro front ends. Obviously, they are not the end-all, be-all of everything. We've talked a lot about the benefits of it, why organizations might want to use it, kind of going along the other tangent. What are some of the reasons you just might simply not want to use it? Like, what are the trade-offs involved with it?
Yeah, so the trade-offs are, if on one side are very appealing, on the other one, micro frontends, they require a high degree of knowledge around the internals. It's still micro frontends as pattern, as practice is pretty new, right? So it's subject to a lot of changes, a lot of nuances, and teams needs to be ready to get their hands dirty into checking, for example, how to fix some bugs that are in libraries that are used to stitch all this thing together. The other thing is that my belief, right? So what I'm saying, I take full accountability. I might be completely wrong. is that micro frontends as we see them right now, they might completely change in 2 years. If everyone remembers the beautiful REST microservice transition, has been a kind of bumpy road, right? Because at the end of the day, we had to go back to accept the fact that separation of concerns, that's how we would scale really the whole API ecosystem. And so what I mean is that, there are so many practices, like from REST, we went to hyperlink API, hypermedia API, to JSON-P, a multitude of different patterns. And then, finally we came to the conclusion that GraphQL is that aggregation point for all read experiences, because the model of aggregation, the model of this kind of like strong scheme of communication, that's where we would give more flexibility to the client and less to the API, so that we could kind of like unify from different consumer the whole provisioning and serving of data. So the same thing is for micro frontends, right? So they're going to be subject to a lot of changes, a lot of growth, a lot of new discoveries, and a lot of new patterns in the next probably couple of years, until probably, React or something new will come up and will solve this problem as an out-of-the-box feature, right? So, like, for example, Zach and the Webpack Federation team are putting an insane amount of effort that is remarkable around this out-of-the-box experience, for example, with Next.js. So, and is remarkable, right? I feel that the progress that are made in that particular space are massive every day. Every day that I read my Twitter feed and I see one of Zach's tweets, I say, wow, it just happened in just a couple of days, right? So I think that time span is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. So one of the trade-off, one of the kind of like things that we need to accept is that as a pattern is going to be subject to a lot of changes. Another kind of like, factor that I would account for that decision to say, yeah, it fits or not, is purely that if you look at micro frontends, they are still complicated to be formalized in terms of definition. So there is a thin line, is almost kind of a blurry hypothetical line between component-driven and micro frontend-driven architecture. Personally, it's so blurry that sometimes, it's hard even to explain. The biggest difference there is that, most of the organization, they try to blend components into design systems. And so that's when I think it gets a little bit, messy.
Yeah.
The reason why, so another kind of like reason for which micro frontend seems a little bit, a burden more than an advantage, is that they require a lot of, mental and cultural and organizational flexibility to reimagine the whole delivery process and the whole accountability and governance, right? Because now the major question is, but if I need something new, what do I do? Because it conflicts with the atomic concept, right? Of I desperately need to make this change, but where do I make this change, right?
So what comes first, micro front ends or internal transformation? It's like the chicken and the egg.
Yeah. So it's actually true, right? But it's like a microservices, right? If we will have a webinar probably about the future of services, because we mentioned them so much, and it's a very dear topic to me. But if you look at what it end up, it's all about connectivity. Mm-hmm. Right, we are simplifying that problem as being going through a different level of grinding, right? You start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you get super thin, right? Because we found that the essence of the whole problem was the connectivity problem. And I think with micro frontends, we will find that the problem that we are solving, like I said in the beginning, is the pure distribution, right? And how can I make it isolated at a certain degree, but easy to integrate on the other, and extensible on the other one. So how can I wide label this functionality so that I can productize what before was just a project? So if you are asking me, as a closing remark, the whole organizational transformation that we are assisting right now, and we will see, is the purely transformation of large scale organization from a project and purely single outcome led process to a product mindset. Because now companies they need to reinvent the way to transform a high intense capital operational capital to capital investment, right? So that now they can create some sort of like loop for which when I create something, it cost me more, but I absorb the cost a long time and I can make it even profitable. Because now all companies, that we like it or not, with this digital revolution that was somehow forced by a force of nature that we couldn't control, they are all digitizing, and so they're all becoming software companies one way or another.
It's yes, forced adoption. It's just simply expedited it, but I'm not necessarily.
It was natural, right?
It's
economical, is economical, is environmental, right? It's all into that.
It's not. People are talking about disturbing it, but really, it is just evolution. It's just the one step after the other.
I call it the R evolution, right? The R between brackets evolution, right? Because if on one side we need to positively evolve, the disruption that the revolution can bring, the little bit of take things down and break them apart, that's also necessary sometimes to have a more organic and more positive evolution, right?
Well, we've got, I think, along that note, some 3 really good questions from the audience and that have come in here. And we've got perfect amount of time of it. First of all, great talk. Thank you. However, I don't know if this was covered, correct me if I'm wrong, that you spoke anything in regards to timelines. How long does it on average take to build an application using micro front-end architecture?
Yeah. So it's a very, very interesting question, because we actually are measuring this with many customers, and the curve is pretty interesting. I was expecting a very steep curve and a lot of time of adoption, and then a slow acceleration. But it seems that we get consistent measurement on having a very, very fast adoption curve. And where we see the slowdown is mostly in the integration piece. And most of the time is in upskilling some of the traditional knowledge. But if you look at the average, squad or team with full stack Node and React, the curve is insanely fast. I was honestly shocked by the speed. So the average of building is very hard to give an absolute measurement, but what we have is that when we estimate certain experiences, we try to bucketize them into a 6 weeks loop. Because that also forces our mind to kind of adopt this divide and conquer mindset. So usually we see that if we have 2 weeks of design or 2 weeks of a sprint for coordinating what the business outcome should be, then we have basically 2 extra sprints for development and releasing. It gets super fast because of the way the pattern is implemented. And probably, so also disclaimer, we are measuring everything against our library. So we are a little bit kind of like biased on the time, because we are measuring to see how fast we can go. And we actually measure using our library and our pattern around a 30% time gain on average without using it.
Wow. Well, I didn't bias data, but that's okay. It's still good to be measuring it. I think we've got time for maybe one more question, and it's a perfect segue from the previous one. Here's a hypothetical for you. If you were tasked with building an e-commerce application, you had about 6 months to do it. Who's your dream team at a high level, and what approach would you take using Micro Frontends?
That's a challenging one. 6 months to build an e-commerce dream team. I mean, it's very, very difficult. Super difficult.
When does anyone have the opportunity to work with their pick and choose a dream team?
If I could, if I could choose a team, probably would be a mixed team of clearly, probably sounds like obvious, but I will probably pick Node, some of Node, the top Node people, connected with a couple of probably front end engineers and a couple of DevOps. So probably, I would probably build a team that is kind of like equally distributed and balanced between having, probably an equal distribution in terms of backend, frontend, and DevOps. That's what I see. I don't like this proportion thing. I think, they're all senior people, so they should all be able to cross-pollinate, but contribute, like they're all, enablers, right, in their own domain. They're not just experts.
Well, we've got, I'm going to do that. I got one more question. Why not? How does building an application using a micro frontend differ in cost and resources? I know you mentioned that it's much more initial cost, or it's a much bigger cost up front, but eventually the ROI will quickly start paying for it.
Yeah. So because now we can distribute, right? So how it differs is that a single page application requires central coordination. So every time that you develop something, it has to be reintegrated into the single page application. While because it's standardized with all these, boxes, as I call it, it's like playing Lego. So we can start to horizontally distribute as much as we want. And the coordination at the shim level is purely done, to stitch together those interfaces that I was mentioning earlier on. So the cost saving is mostly at the coordination level. What I saw in my experience is that the larger the organization is, the higher it gets the short-term benefit of implementing such a pattern versus a small size organization, where the benefit of micro frontend gets stretched longer in time. So it requires, clearly, back to the previous question, right? You need to have a great enablement team to make it possible, or else it's going to be an infinite loop of meetings.
See, that's why I had to ask that last question. It was just very simple.
Yeah.
I would have kept me up all night long. Thank you so much, everybody who joined us here today. Much as to be expected, it was a fantastic talk, Luca. This webinar will be distributed to all of those in attendance as well. Keep an eye on our social media feeds for it to be uploaded onto YouTube. Thank you again. Some great events coming up in the near coming month. I think Luca actually might have given a couple of spoiler alerts for some things that we might be working on. But yeah, everybody
follow me on Twitter. That's the easiest way to find all these things, right? I mean, Chris, you will share my Twitter handle so that people.
When this goes into post, we'll have it like going across the bottom right here. We'll have like big obscene hands pointing to it. Nobody will miss it, I promise.
Feel free to ask any question.
Awesome. Yes. And everybody have a great weekend. Thank you again. And we look forward to talking to you next time.
Bye, everyone. See you at the next webinar.